Lightning ripped across the rainforest sky as two lives, one human, one animal, stepped into a tragedy that wasn't theirs to fix. What followed wasn't just survival. It was the kind of mercy that humbles even the strongest hearts. Stay through the final twist, hit like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from so we know who's walking this journey with us. The rain came down in furious sheets, each drop a needle piercing through the canopy of the rainforest, as thunder cracked above like the sky itself was splitting open. Malcolm Pierce, a tall, broad-shouldered black ranger in his early 40s, moved cautiously along the flooded trail boots, sinking deep into the mud. His khaki uniform clung to his skin, soaked and heavy. The storm had turned the forest into a world of motion branches thrashing, rivers swelling, and wind screaming through the trees. But through it all, one sound cut deeper than the thunder, the low, steady breathing of his German Shepherd Bran, pacing close by Fur, matted amber eyes scanning the dark. The two had worked together for years through hurricanes, floods, and wildfires. Yet tonight, something about the jungle felt wrong. Bran stopped suddenly, ears pricking up, tail stiff as a rod. His nostrils flared, then a soft growl rumbled from his throat. Malcolm tightened his grip on the flashlight. "What is it?" Boy Bran didn't answer with a bark, but turned sharply, her gaze locked toward the west ridge where the stream cut through. Then from the distance came a sound that didn't belong to the storm, a long, trembling cry that rose and fell like a broken melody. Malcolm froze, every nerve in his body going still. It wasn't human yet. It struck his chest with the same power as a mother's scream. The cry came again, deeper, this time layered with despair that clawed at the air. Bran whined low and took off through the rain mud, splashing beneath his paws. "Bran, wait," Malcolm called, running after him, heart pounding. Branches whipped against his arms as he stumbled forward, guided only by the beam of his flickering light. The storm swallowed every sound except that haunting cry that refused to die out. Then lightning tore the sky apart, illuminating the clearing ahead, and Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. There, at the edge of the flood-swollen river, knelt a massive female gorilla cradling a limp bundle in her arms. Her fur was soaked and plastered against her body, her face contorted in anguish. Beside her stood a male, towering and powerful, his chest heaving, his fists pounding into the earth with a sound that echoed like war drums. The baby gorilla in the mother's arms didn't move. Its small hand hung lifeless, caked with mud. The mother pressed her face against it, letting out another guttural wail that sliced through the storm and into Malcolm's bones. For a moment he couldn't breathe. The sight, raw, intimate, unbearably human, dragged him backward through time. He saw himself again standing in a hospital corridor holding his daughter's hand as the monitor flatlined. That same helpless sound, the one he thought only a human heart could make, was now pouring from a creature of the wild. Bran whimpered softly and inched forward, head lowered, as if he too recognized grief. The rain poured harder, as if heaven itself was crying along. Malcolm took a step forward, his instincts as a ranger battling the ache inside him. He had witnessed animals mourn before a mother deer pacing beside a fallen fawn, a wolf howling over its mate, but nothing like this. This wasn't instinct. This was love refusing to let go. The gorilla mother rocked back and forth, clutching her baby tighter, while the father stood like a fortress behind her chest, trembling, his roars shaking the flooded ground. Bran barked once, sharp and loud, the sound slicing through the chaos. The father whipped around, muscles tensing, eyes burning like molten amber. Malcolm froze. "Easy, boy," he whispered to Bran, who immediately sat, eyes locked on the gorilla. The massive beast glared at them, water streaming from his fur fists clenched. One move too close and it could end in seconds. Yet even through the rage, Malcolm saw something else, a question in those eyes. The same question he'd asked God that night years ago. Why the mother's cries grew softer, turning into a low hum, rhythmic and shaking. Bran tilted his head, emitting a quiet whine as if responding. The dog's body language shifted no fear, and only empathy. Malcolm had seen that look in Bran before when he found a dying fawn tangled in barbed wire. The dog had approached it, not with curiosity, but sorrow. It was the same now. The rain eased slightly, falling in heavy, even drops. Malcolm lowered his flashlight and took a slow step forward. "We're not here to hurt you," he murmured, though his voice barely carried over the rain. The gorilla father took one thundering step forward, slamming his fists into the mud, sending water flying. Bran didn't back down. He lay flat instead, head resting on his paws, exposing his vulnerability in the oldest language of peace. The mother lifted her head, her dark eyes flickering between her mate, the motionless child, and the man with the gentle tone. Her massive hands trembled as she brushed the baby's fur. Malcolm realized she wasn't holding on to a body anymore. She was holding on to hope, the same thing he had once clung to long after the doctors had left the room. He swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I know," he whispered. "I know that sound." The male gorilla's chest stopped rising for a moment. The rain slowed into a hush, replaced by the heavy rhythm of breath. Three beings, each grieving something different, yet the same. Bran lifted his head again and let out a soft sound, half whine, half sigh. It was enough to shift something invisible. The mother's eyes locked on him. She reached out a trembling hand towards the river, then looked back at Malcolm as if pleading for something he didn't yet understand. For the first time, the wild didn't feel dangerous. It felt sacred. Malcolm dropped to one knee, lowering himself to the mud, showing he meant no harm. The father gorilla stood tall behind the mother, a monument of loss and defiance. The storm had not stopped, only softened into a steady drumbeat as dawn pressed weak light through the canopy. Malcolm Pierce knelt near the edge of the flooded creek water, swirling around his boots, the scent of wet earth thick in the air. The gorilla mother still rocked her child, her massive arms trembling under the weight of what she refused to let go. The father stood close now, chest still heaving, but quieter, his fury dulled into a kind of hollow watchfulness. Bran stayed beside Malcolm motionless, except for the twitch of his ears, eyes never leaving the baby's small, unmoving hand. The world around them was heavy with aftermath, broken branches, uprooted plants, and the river swollen with mud and debris. Malcolm wiped the rain from his face, his hand shaking. He knew floods like this. He had studied them for years. Nature rarely acted alone. Something about the flow felt wrong. The angle of the current, the violent cut through the soil, it didn't happen without help. He scanned the water, his instincts whispering that the tragedy had a source far more human than it appeared. Bran suddenly moved, nose pressed low to the ground, sniffing through the mud near the child's resting place. He pawed at something buried under the wet soil and pulled out a twisted shard of dull metal, jagged and sharp along one edge. Malcolm leaned closer, recognition hitting him like a punch to the chest. It was a fragment of a man-made drainage grate, the kind installed by the park's maintenance team along the upstream levee. He turned it over in his gloved hand, the edges still bent from force. The river hadn't taken the baby on its own. The barrier had broken under pressure, sending a wall of water barreling through the gorge. Someone had signed off that repair 6 months ago. Someone named Malcolm Pierce. His breath hitched. He had overseen that project himself, rushing the work order when the last storm warnings came in. He'd told the crew to seal it good enough because they were short on daylight. Good enough had killed this child. The thought hollowed him. He looked at the gorilla mother again. Her eyes half closed her fingers, tracing tiny circles on the baby's muddy fur, and his chest filled with a guilt so fierce it hurt to breathe. Bran dropped the metal shard at his feet, as if to remind him that truth didn't hide underwater forever. "Easy boy," Malcolm whispered, though the words came out rough. The father gorilla turned toward him, then eyes like amber glass unblinking. For a moment, Malcolm thought he might charge again, but instead, the creature took one step closer and stopped, massive chest rising slowly. Their gazes locked, and something unspoken passed between them, a terrible understanding of how fragile everything was when men tried to control the wild. Bran whimpered softly, pressing his nose against Malcolm's knee. The dog's coat was drenched, his breathing quick and shallow, but his focus never wavered. He looked between the man and the gorilla family as if trying to keep the fragile piece alive by his own will. Malcolm slowly lowered the piece of metal into the mud, burying it under his palm. He could not undo what had been done, but he could make meaning from it. He could try to save what was left. He shifted closer, his voice breaking through the sound of the rain. "Let me help her," he said quietly, though he knew they couldn't understand the words. Yet tone mattered more than language. He extended a hand towards a small, still body, fingers trembling. The mother gorilla looked up sharply, clutching her child tighter, her lips pulling back in a silent warning. Bran immediately responded, lying down flat in the mud tail pressed to the earth, eyes soft. The gesture was pure submission, instinctive and ancient. The mother's breathing slowed. Her gaze moved from the dog's quiet humility to the man's outstretched hand. Then, hesitating, she loosened her grip, just enough for Malcolm to see the child's face, mud-streaked still, but not beyond reach. Malcolm leaned forward, rain dripping from his chin, and placed 2 fingers gently against the small chest. No pulse. The chill of the body told him time was slipping away fast. He pulled his hand back, fighting the rising tide of hopelessness. Behind him, the father let out a sound, low guttural, the kind of grief that shook the trees. Malcolm flinched, heart pounding, every instinct screaming to run, yet his feet rooted in place. Bran lifted his head slightly, eyes following the mother's every motion, ready but calm. The gorilla female turned her face towards the river, letting out one long moan that rose above the storm like the last note of a hymn. It wasn't just mourning, it was surrender. Malcolm swallowed hard, realizing this moment wasn't just about a wild creature losing her young. It was about him facing the cost of his own compromises. The wilderness didn't forgive shortcuts. Bran suddenly barked sharp and quick, breaking the trance. His nose pointed upstream and Malcolm followed his gaze. The rain thinned into a mist, but the air was still thick with tension, heavy enough that every breath burned. Malcolm Pierce stayed crouched in the mud, hands open, water dripping down his arms, his heart beating like a drum buried beneath his ribs. The gorilla mother held her still child closer, her body trembling with exhaustion, while the father stood frozen a few feet away, a living storm of muscle and grief. For a heartbeat, the jungle was silent, except for the muted gurgle of the floodwaters retreating. Bran stood rigid at Malcolm's side, his paws sunk deep in the muck, every instinct tuned to the unspoken language of threat. The air felt electric, charged with grief and fury, both too vast to contain. Then, with a sound that tore through the forest like a cannon, the father gorilla roared. It wasn't a warning, it was anguish turned into thunder. He pounded his chest once, twice, and then lunged forward, a blur of power and pain. Malcolm barely had time to react. He threw his arms up his body, instinctively curling to shield his head, but before the beast reached him, Bran launched forward. The shepherd's bark cracked the air, sharp and defiant, and he stood between man and gorilla legs, braced head low, eyes blazing. The impact didn't come. The gorilla halted mid-charge, inches from the dog, his breath heavy and steaming in the cold rain. For one terrible second, all Malcolm could see was Bran's small form facing a creature 10 times his size, and his voice caught in his throat. Bran knew, he whispered, but the dog didn't move. The gorilla's massive chest rose and fell in furious rhythm fists, clenched teeth bared. Bran didn't growl, he simply stared, unflinching, as if he understood something Malcolm couldn't. The air hung suspended, time itself, pausing on the edge of catastrophe. Malcolm's hands trembled, his eyes darting between them. He had seen that look before, not in a beast, but in a mirror. The gorilla's eyes weren't full of mindless violence. They were full of the same haunted, desperate light that had once filled his own the night his daughter was taken by a world too cruel to explain. The recognition struck him with such force that his fear cracked and fell away. He rose slowly, a palm still out, his voice low, almost breaking. "You're not angry at me," he said quietly. "You're angry at the world." The words dissolved into the rain, but the meaning lingered. The gorilla's muscles trembled. Bran took a careful step backward, allowing space between them. The beast let out a guttural sound, part snarl, part sob, and slammed his fists into the mud beside the child instead of Malcolm's skull. The earth shook under the impact. The mother whimpered softly, clutching her baby tighter. Malcolm's legs nearly gave out from the adrenaline, but he held his ground. He watched the gorilla's massive shoulders heave as the animal leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the wet ground beside his child. The storm outside had ended, but the one inside him still raged silent and merciless. Bran slowly approached the edge of the clearing, tail low but steady. The gorilla turned his head slightly, eyes tracking the movement, but did not attack. Instead, he exhaled a long, trembling breath that came out as a low, mournful rumble. It was the sound of surrender, not defeat. Malcolm knelt again, the mud cold beneath his knees, and pressed his hand to the ground in front of him. His voice barely carried over the patter of rain. "We both failed someone," he whispered. The gorilla blinked slowly, water streaming from his brow, and Malcolm thought he saw the faintest flicker of understanding, something deeper than instinct. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was recognition. Bran looked between them, then slowly moved closer to the small body lying still in the mother's arms. His movements were deliberate, respectful, the same way he'd once approached a wounded fawn years ago on a rescue mission. The mother tensed but didn't move. Bran sniffed the baby's hand, then lifted his eyes to Malcolm, a silent plea passing through them. Malcolm understood. He didn't know how, but he did. "All right, boy," he said softly. "We'll try again." The gorilla father lifted his head, the sound of his breath deep and slow, watching every motion. Malcolm could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He was standing at the fault line between trust and extinction, and it could crumble at any moment. Bran turned back toward the gorilla, let out one short, almost questioning bark, then sat. The simplicity of that action seemed to reach across the divide. Two creatures of different worlds, bound by the same code of loyalty. Malcolm felt a lump rise in his throat. "You see him?" he murmured toward the gorilla. "He'd die for me, just like you would have for your son." The beast's chest rose sharply, his nostrils flaring, his eyes narrowing, but the rage had softened. Malcolm took a step closer to the riverbank, mud sucking at his boots. He stopped within 10 feet of the gorilla father. Neither moved. The air smelled of rain and iron and loss. "We're not enemies," Malcolm said, his voice cracking. "We're just two fathers trying to survive what's left." The gorilla let out a sound low and resonant, then turned his face upward toward the canopy. A shaft of pale light broke through, glinting off the wet leaves. Bran wagged his tail, once the motion slow and uncertain. Malcolm exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. He could still feel the raw ache of guilt tearing at him, but now it wasn't just his burden. The jungle had absorbed it, carried it, shared it. The father gorilla lowered his head again, resting his hand on the mother's back. The moment held a fragile peace born from exhaustion, grief, and unspoken kinship. The clearing lay drowned in silence, broken only by the breath of the river and the slow dripping of rain from the leaves. The storm had passed, but the world it left behind was shattered and raw. Malcolm Pierce remained kneeling in the mud, his knees numb, his mind reeling from what had just happened. The father gorilla had stopped his charge, his fury burned out into something hollow, something that mirrored the empty ache in Malcolm's own chest. The mother sat still, her arms cradling the small body, rocking slowly, as though motion alone could keep time from moving forward. Bran stood close to Malcolm, his fur streaked with dirt and rain his ears back, but his body calm. He no longer trembled. He only watched, his gaze locked on the baby, his instinct guiding him to stillness. Every inch of the clearing carried the weight of something sacred, the kind of quiet that followed catastrophe and dared not be broken. Malcolm shifted his weight and pressed a hand to the wet earth, grounding himself in the present. He looked at the mother, her face slack with grief, but her eyes alive with thought. She was not just mourning, she was deciding. Every breath she took came with a small sound, half whimper, half hum, like a lullaby with no child left to soothe. The father loomed beside her, his breathing steady but watchful, his massive body trembling from exhaustion. Malcolm's throat tightened. He had stood at graves before his daughters, his fathers, even the unmarked ones of men lost on duty. But this one, this patch of mud and heartbreak, felt different. It felt like judgment and mercy tangled into one. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the soaked field notebook he carried everywhere, the pages warped and blurred from the storm. Inside was a sketch of the drainage plan he had signed off on the one that failed. He stared at it, the ink bleeding until all the lines merged into a dark smear. He shut the book, slipped it back into his pocket, and looked up again. "I can't fix this," he whispered, voice breaking in the heavy air. "But I can try." His words faded into the mist, yet something shifted. The gorilla mother's humming stopped. Her breathing steadied. Bran moved first. He took a slow step forward, paused, sinking deep water splashing around him. His head was low, his tail motionless. He walked not as a protector, but as a pilgrim. When he reached the edge of the family's circle, he stopped, lifted one paw, and placed it gently on the mud between them. The gesture was small, but it was everything. The father tensed, shoulders coiling, but the mother did not move. Her gaze was locked on the dog. Bran stayed still, breathing slow and deep, his eyes soft and pleading. Then something unbelievable happened. The mother lowered her eyes to her child, lifted her head toward Malcolm, and slowly extended her long, trembling arm. With infinite care, she placed her baby on the ground between them. The moment felt endless. Malcolm didn't move. The father let out a low sound, neither growl nor roar, more like a word from an ancient language forgotten by both man and beast. Bran took one step back, letting the mother finish what she had chosen to begin. Malcolm's heart pounded so hard it hurt. He looked from the baby to the mother, then to the father, who stood like a statue carved from rain and grief. The mother's hand lingered over the small body for a moment, fingers brushing against the soaked fur. And then she withdrew inch by inch until the child lay exposed on the wet ground. It was an offering, a surrender, but not to death. It was trust. Malcolm felt tears sting his eyes, hot and helpless. He didn't know what he had done to earn this moment, perhaps nothing at all, but he understood it was the only chance left to make something right. He moved forward slowly, each step deliberate. Bran stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. The ground felt alive beneath them, humming with tension and hope. The mother lowered her head eyes, never leaving her baby. The father inhaled deeply, nostrils flaring, his body poised like a coiled spring. Malcolm stopped just a few feet away from the child, close enough to feel the faint residual warmth of the mother's touch still clinging to its fur. He looked down at the lifeless body, the tiny fingers curled against the chest, the mud covering its small face. "All right," he whispered, voice shaking. "We'll try." He removed his soaked gloves and set them aside, his hands bare, trembling. Bran lowered his head, sniffed the air once, and then did something that made Malcolm's breath catch. The dog nudged his own collar loose with his paw, pushing forward the metal ranger medallion that hung from it, a token from years of service scratched and worn. He pushed it toward the baby, resting it near its small hand. Malcolm froze, staring at the symbol gleaming faintly in the dim light. It was as though Bran understood what this meant better than either of them, that this was more than rescue. This was confession. The father gorilla's eyes followed the motion, his breathing slowing. He tilted his head slightly, almost as if in acknowledgement. Malcolm looked at Bran, unable to speak. The dog's tail moved once a faint wag that trembled in the air like a sigh. The mother let out a deep exhale, her body shuddering, and for the first time since the storm began, she made no sound of pain. The clearing held its breath as Malcolm Pierce knelt before the tiny gorilla rain drizzling like silver threads from the canopy above. The jungle no longer howled. It listened. Every sound, every whisper of air seemed pulled toward that small, unmoving body lying in the mud. The mother sat just behind, hands pressed together, rocking faintly while the father crouched close enough that Malcolm could hear the deep rumble of his chest, a sound that vibrated through the ground like the earth itself, breathing in grief. Bran stood beside Malcolm, soaked and trembling, not from fear, but from awareness, his golden eyes fixed on the baby with a concentration so intense it felt human. Malcolm's fingers hovered over the infant's chest. He had performed CPR before on people on animals, but never under the gaze of two wild creatures capable of ending him in seconds. He swallowed his throat tight. "Okay, little one," he whispered. "Stay with me." His hands pressed down slow and steady, counting the rhythm that had once been muscle memory. 1, 2, 3. His palms met resistance, the delicate ribcage bending beneath his touch. He released, then pressed again, each movement careful but desperate. The mother let out a low sound halfway between a cry and a prayer. The father leaned closer, nostrils flaring. Malcolm didn't look up. He focused only on the motion compress, release, breathe, repeat. Rain pooled around his hands, washing mud across his fingers. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, pushing harder. Nothing. Bran whined softly, circling his paws, sinking into the mud. Malcolm paused for a moment, wiped his face with his forearm, and bent lower. He tilted the baby's head back, sealing his mouth gently over the tiny muzzle, and exhaled. The air left him slow and steady, carrying with it everything he still believed in: faith, guilt, love, and stubborn defiance. He drew back, looked for movement, for anything, but there was only stillness. He pressed again. The rain fell harder, drumming against the leaves, blurring the edges of the clearing into gray. The father let out a sound that made Malcolm's chest seize. It was the sound of someone losing hope. The ranger didn't stop. He couldn't. Every push of his palms felt like striking a drumbeat against death's door. He pressed once more, exhaled again, then waited. Still nothing. His hands fell away, shaking. The mother moaned, her voice low and cracking, and the father slammed a fist into the mud beside them, water splashing up in cold arcs. Malcolm sat back on his heels, panting chest-burning rain running down his face like tears he refused to show. He stared at the tiny body lying still before him, at the mud clinging to its fur, at the silence that grew heavier with every passing second. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "Not yet. Not like this." Bran moved, then slowly, quietly, his instincts pulling him toward the baby. Malcolm barely noticed until the dog nudged his arm. Bran's nose pressed against the small chest, sniffing, then pawed once lightly, almost tenderly, before letting out a whine that rose into a higher pitch. Malcolm blinked, startled, then leaned forward. The dog pawed again, more deliberate this time, as if urging him to continue. "You feel something." Malcolm's voice cracked. He placed his fingers against the chest again, holding his breath. For an instant, just one heartbeat, he felt it. A twitch, a faint, almost imagined tremor beneath the skin. He froze, heart racing. "There," he whispered. "There, Bran, you're right." But before he could move again, the pulse vanished, gone as quickly as it came, leaving only silence behind. Malcolm's stomach twisted. He clenched his teeth, his fingers shaking. "No," he growled low and furious. "You don't quit now." He pressed down again, this time harder, more rhythmic pushing, with the kind of precision that came from somewhere beyond thought. Bran barked once, sharp, echoing through the clearing. The gorilla mother's eyes widened. She leaned closer, one hand reaching out as if to touch her child, but stopping short. The father's breathing grew deeper, heavier, his head lowering until his massive face was just above Malcolm's shoulder. The man felt the warmth of its breath, but didn't flinch. He just kept pressing. "Come on," he whispered again, over and over, the words blurring into the rhythm of his movements. He tilted the baby's head, exhaled again, then returned to the compressions. Bran's body pressed against his side, as if lending his strength to the effort. The rain slowed, turning to mist. The jungle fell completely still, even the insects silent. Malcolm lost count of time, lost sense of himself. There was only pressure and breath motion and silence, heartbeat and absence. Then, when the last thread of strength began to slip from his arms, Bran let out a bark so sudden it startled him. The dog's paw pressed once more against the baby's chest, and beneath it, faint, almost invisible, the skin moved. A flicker. Malcolm's pulse jumped. "It's there," he gasped, pressing again. "Come on, keep going." He counted the beats under his breath, matching Bran's rhythm dog, and man moving in unison, hope rising through exhaustion. The mother let out a sound that trembled through the trees, and the father's massive hand lowered toward the ground, not in anger this time, but in trembling anticipation. "Stay with us," Malcolm murmured, voice raw. "Stay." He tilted the baby's head again, sealed his lips over its mouth, and gave one more breath, pouring everything he had left into it. The chest rose slightly, then fell. Bran whined, nudging the baby's arm, gently refusing to look away. The air around them thickened until even the sound of rain seemed to vanish. Malcolm waited, counting seconds that stretched into eternity. 1, 2, 3, nothing. 4, 5, then movement. A twitch, small but undeniable, the fingers curled faintly. Malcolm's breath caught. There, he whispered, his hands shaking. "There." The mother cried out a high, desperate sound that broke through the clearing, while the father raised his head to the sky, letting out a deep, rumbling call that sounded more like a plea than a roar. The first pulse had given Malcolm Pierce a reason to fight, but now that fragile spark flickered, slipping in and out beneath his trembling hands. The baby gorilla's chest would rise and fall once, then pause for what felt like forever, leaving only silence and fear hanging in the humid air. The father loomed over him, close enough that Malcolm could feel his breath mixing with the steam rising from the wet ground, while the mother sat a few feet away, her hands clenched together, her eyes wide and shining with something beyond grief. It was hope battling disbelief. Bran pressed his body against Malcolm's side, his fur slick from rain, his heartbeat rapid and steady, grounding his human companion as both of them worked against the impossible. The ranger's arms ached, his fingers numb, but he refused to let the rhythm falter. Each push was a prayer, each breath a promise. "Come on," he whispered, counting under his breath. "Come on, little one, you're almost there." But as the seconds dragged on, the rhythm broke. The small chest stopped moving again. The pulse vanished. The line between hope and defeat became so thin it almost disappeared. Malcolm sat back for half a second, head spinning, chest heaving. Bran barked once sharply, his voice slicing through the silence. "I know," Malcolm said, shaking his head. "I know, boy. I can't stop." He reached forward again, pressing harder, ignoring the burning pain in his shoulders. Rainwater dripped from his chin into the mud, mixing with sweat and tears. The jungle around them felt suspended, every leaf, every insect, every drop of water frozen in anticipation. Then suddenly, Bran growled a low, guttural sound Malcolm had only heard once before the night they cornered a wounded bear. He looked up and saw movement. The father gorilla had risen to his full height, his massive body towering like a shadow cast by the earth itself. His chest heaved, his fists curling, his face twisted between sorrow and suspicion. The pulse had vanished again, and in the father's eyes, it looked like failure, a mistake, a threat. Malcolm froze, his hands still pressed to the baby's chest. Bran moved instinctively, stepping forward with a bark that shook the clearing. His body angled sideways to shield Malcolm. "Easy," Malcolm said, under his breath, though his voice was barely audible. "Don't." But Bran's hackles rose anyway, his instinct clashing with his obedience. The gorilla's roar tore through the forest, so powerful that the air seemed to vibrate. The mother cried out and reached for him, but he stepped closer, mud splashing under his enormous feet. The line between protection and violence blurred. Malcolm knew if the gorilla struck, he wouldn't survive. He also knew if he moved suddenly, everything would unravel. His mind raced. He looked at Bran, his loyal partner, the one creature who had followed him through every disaster, and whispered, "Stay." Bran's body trembled, but he obeyed. The gorilla's chest rose again, his fists trembling at his sides, ready to crush whatever stood between him and his child. Malcolm's heart pounded so loud it drowned out the rain. Then the mother moved. She stood not running, not retreating, but walking slowly toward them, her movements deliberate, her body swaying as if calming a storm. She reached out one massive hand and touched the father's arm. He flinched but didn't push her away. Her eyes met his for a long, agonizing moment. Then, in a gesture that froze everyone in place, she turned from him and stepped toward Malcolm. He didn't move. Bran didn't bark. The mother stopped just behind him, her presence vast, her shadow stretching across the ground. He felt her before he saw her, a warmth, a pressure, a heartbeat that wasn't his own. Then slowly her hand came to rest on his shoulder. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, but steady. Every nerve in Malcolm's body came alive. The message was clear. She understood. She trusted. His breath shook as he whispered, "I've got him. I'm still here." The father's roar faded into a deep rumble, confused but no longer furious. Bran's tail flicked once his body relaxing slightly, though his eyes stayed locked on the larger beast. Malcolm turned his focus back to the baby. He pressed again, slower this time, aligning his rhythm with the soft rise and fall of the rain. "You're not leaving," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Not after this. Not now." The mother's hand stayed on his shoulder, grounding him, her breathing steady. The world seemed to shrink to the size of his palms, pressing down, and the faint pulse that refused to stay dead. Then Bran made a sound, a single soft bark, almost like a whisper. Malcolm pressed one last time, leaned close, and exhaled another breath into the tiny lungs. The body jerked slightly, just enough for his hands to feel it. His head snapped up, eyes wide. There he breathed. "Come on, that's it." He pressed again, twice more. The fingers twitched. The chest shuddered, then stopped. It wasn't enough, not yet. The father moved closer, but slower now, watching his heavy breaths echoing across the clearing. Bran stepped aside, allowing the gorilla to see his child clearly. The mother dropped to her knees, still keeping her hand on Malcolm's arm. He looked back once, meeting her gaze, and in that silent exchange, every boundary between them dissolved. He turned forward again and pressed once more. "Breathe," he whispered. "Please breathe." He tilted the baby's head, inhaled, and gave another breath, his lungs burning. The tiny chest rose again, this time higher. Then again. Then again. Bran barked once more, sharp and excited, his tail wagging for the first time since the flood began. The father let out a sound that was neither roar nor cry, but something raw and human. The baby didn't move yet, not fully, but the rhythm had returned. Malcolm leaned back, his eyes wet, his whole body shaking. He exhaled and looked up at the two massive creatures staring down at him. For a long moment, the world stood still, caught between silence and eternity. The only sound was Malcolm Pierce's ragged breathing and the faint patter of rain fading into mist. The gorilla mother's hand still rested on his arm, trembling slightly as her eyes darted between her child's limp body and the man who refused to give up. The father loomed close, his huge form casting a shadow over them, all his breathing deep, slow, but no longer violent. Bran remained on Malcolm's right side, panting heavily, his eyes locked on the baby gorilla's chest, his fur slick and clinging to his skin. Everything waited for something unseen, something fragile and precious, the thin thread between life and memory. Malcolm's fingers pressed again, slow and rhythmic, pushing against the small rib cage that had once been silent and was now, he hoped, remembering how to move. He leaned forward and breathed once more into the small mouth, whispering between each effort, "Come on, little one. You've come this far. Don't stop now." The rain stopped entirely. The air thickened with humidity, the scent of earth and leaves and lightning filling Malcolm's lungs. He lifted his head slightly, staring at the baby's chest. For one unbearable second, nothing happened. Then suddenly, a faint cough, weak and sharp, broke the silence. Malcolm froze, eyes wide. Bran's ears perked. The mother let out a sound that started as a moan, but grew into a cry, her hands trembling. "That's it," Malcolm whispered, his voice shaking. "That's it. Breathe." But the small body went still again, the chest refusing to rise. The flicker of hope turned into another blade, twisting inside him. "No, no," he murmured, leaning forward again, pressing down with renewed force. "You're not done. You're not done yet," Bran whined, pacing in a tight circle, his tail low, his anxiety palpable. The mother pressed her knuckles to her lips, her body rocking slightly. The father leaned closer, nostrils flaring, a low rumble escaping his chest. Malcolm felt his strength failing his arms, trembling so hard he could barely hold the rhythm. Every muscle screamed for rest, every breath hurt. But something deeper, older, kept him moving. "Breathe," he said again, each word a plea. He tilted the baby's head back, inhaled deeply, and gave another breath. Nothing. He pressed down once, twice, 3 times. Then suddenly, another cough erupted louder this time, followed by a weak sputtering sound. Water and mud spewed from the tiny mouth. The chest convulsed once, then again, then miraculously expanded. The small ribs lifted under his hands, a shallow gasp following the motion. The baby's fingers twitched. Malcolm drew back, disbelief written across his face. "He's breathing," he whispered, almost too afraid to say it aloud. Bran barked once, sharp and joyous, the sound echoing through the clearing. The mother cried out a raw, piercing wail that broke through every barrier between human and animal. She lunged forward, gathering her child in her arms, pressing him to her chest, her tears mixing with the rain. The father threw back his head and roared, not in anger, but in something triumphant, primal, and holy. The forest answered him, the echoes rippling through the trees like thunder. Malcolm fell back into the mud, his arms dropping to his sides, his heart hammering in disbelief. He looked up at the sky through the breaks in the canopy, where faint sunlight began to spill through, soft and golden. The storm was ending. Bran barked again, but the sound was weaker now, more like a sigh than a shout. Malcolm turned to him and saw the dog sway slightly, his legs shaking. "Hey, easy," Malcolm said, reaching for him. Bran staggered a step forward, his body trembling with exhaustion, then collapsed onto his side in the mud. "No, no, no," Malcolm whispered, crawling to him, pulling the dog's head into his lap. Bran's eyes blinked slowly, his chest rising and falling unevenly. "You're okay, boy," Malcolm said, his voice breaking. "You're okay. You did it. You did it, Bran." He stroked the dog's head, his fingers running over the wet fur. Bran's tail moved weakly, a small, tired wag. The gorilla mother didn't move from where she sat cradling her child. The father lowered himself beside them, pressing his forehead to the ground near his mate's feet. The jungle moments ago alive with chaos was now transformed into something sacred. The air shimmered with heat and peace. Malcolm looked at the baby gorilla, its tiny chest now rising and falling on its own, slow and steady. The mother rocked back and forth, humming softly, her earlier cries replaced by low, rhythmic sounds of comfort. The father's breathing matched hers, the great heaves of his chest easing into calm. Bran stirred his eyes, following the sound of the mother's song. He let out a soft whine, and Malcolm smiled through tears that refused to stop. "You did good, partner," he whispered. Better than me. The dog licked his wrist weakly, then rested his head against Malcolm's leg, eyes fluttering shut. The light continued to grow rays filtering through the treetops until the whole clearing glowed. Malcolm couldn't tell if it was the rising sun or simply the world finally remembering how to shine. He looked at his hands, muddy trembling, still covered in rainwater and traces of life, and exhaled slowly. The sound of the baby's breathing filled his ears steady and real. "You're gonna make it," he said softly, half to the baby, half to Bran, and maybe a little to himself. The father gorilla raised his head and looked directly at him. Their eyes met again. No anger, no threat, just quiet recognition. Malcolm nodded once, unable to speak. The gorilla returned the gesture, then turned back to his family. The mother's song continued, a low hum that vibrated through the air. Bran's breathing steadied, slow and peaceful, his body finally surrendering to rest. Malcolm sat there between them, caught between two worlds, surrounded by life that moments ago had seemed impossible. He reached out one last time, touching the ground between them, feeling its warmth beneath his palm. "We did it," he whispered. The first faint light of morning spread across the drenched jungle like a slow-moving tide of gold crawling through the branches, painting the mud with warmth that had been missing for too long. The air smelled of rain and life. Malcolm Pierce sat still, mud clinging to his uniform, his hands resting on his knees as he stared at the scene before him. The gorilla mother cradling her child, the father leaning close, their bodies trembling with relief as soft sounds of breathing filled the air. The baby stirred again, its tiny hand twitching its chest, lifting and falling in a rhythm that was fragile but true. Bran lay beside Malcolm, exhausted, his fur plastered flat, his breathing slow but steady, his head resting against the man's thigh. The jungle was waking up around them, birds calling cautiously through the mist, insects beginning their endless hum. For the first time since the storm began, everything was alive again. The mother gorilla began to hum a low, rhythmic sound that rose and fell like a lullaby written by the forest itself. She rocked gently, her lips brushing the baby's fur, eyes closed as tears slipped down her face. The father shifted beside her, and then, without warning, he lifted his head toward the thinning clouds. His chest expanded, his massive arms spread, and from deep within him came a roar so powerful that it vibrated through the soil, through the trees, through Malcolm's bones. It was not anger this time, it was triumph. It was the sound of loss turning into life. Malcolm froze the sound, striking a place inside him that had been silent for years. He remembered his own cry that night long ago when he had stood in the hospital parking lot, clutching his daughter's jacket, screaming into a sky that didn't answer. The echo of that pain now merged with this moment, as if both roars, his and the gorilla's, were meant to find each other through time. He looked down, blinking fast, trying to hold himself together, but the dam had already cracked. The tears came hot and unrelenting, washing trails through the dirt on his face. He lowered his head, pressing his palms to his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice trembling. "I'm so damn sorry." His shoulders shook as he spoke. Not to anyone, not even to himself, but to everything. The broken barrier, the flood, his daughter, the life he couldn't save, the life he almost failed to fight for now. Bran stirred beside him, lifting his head weakly. The dog's eyes clouded with exhaustion, but still full of clarity, focused on his partner's face. Slowly, Bran shifted, pressing his paw against Malcolm's knee. The simple gesture was soft, small, and yet it stopped the man's sobs. Malcolm looked down through tears at the muddy paw resting on his leg. Bran didn't move. He just looked at him with that calm, knowing expression that said more than words ever could. "You stayed," Malcolm murmured, voice cracking. "You always stay." He reached down and stroked the dog's head, feeling the tremor beneath the fur. The touch grounded him, brought him back to the moment, back to the warmth that was slowly returning to the world. He turned toward the gorilla family again. The mother looked up, her gaze soft, her breathing calm as she held her baby close. The father crouched lower, placing one massive hand on the ground beside her, the other touching the child's back. The infant coughed weakly, then let out a sound so tiny, so human, it broke what was left of Malcolm's composure. It was a cry not of pain, but of life of lungs rediscovering air. The mother gasped and pressed her forehead to her child, crying openly, while the father let out another roar, shaking the last raindrops from the leaves above. The golden light broke through fully now, scattering over the clearing, turning every drop of water into a spark. Malcolm watched in silence, awe spreading through him like warmth after frostbite. He had seen births rescues and even miracles in his years as a ranger, but nothing like this. This wasn't nature obeying the laws of survival. This was nature choosing mercy. The father gorilla turned his face toward the light, the sun hitting his eyes, his fur glistening like polished bronze. He roared again, and this time it wasn't just sound, it was a declaration. The forest seemed to answer back, birds calling, frogs croaking, the entire canopy alive with echoes of that impossible cry. Bran barked once, a faint, tired sound that almost felt like agreement. Malcolm managed a smile through his tears. "Yeah," he whispered, "we heard you." He felt the weight of everything he'd done pressing against his chest. The shortcuts, the mistakes, the way he had let the system corrode his sense of responsibility. But now, somehow in this place, forgiveness felt possible. Not because he deserved it, but because life had chosen to return despite his failures. The gorilla family slowly drew closer together, their bodies forming a single dark shape against the glowing mud. The mother's hum returned, soft and endless, a melody of survival. The father lowered his head again, placing his massive forehead against his mate's shoulder. The baby nestled between them, small fingers curling around a lock of fur. Malcolm watched them, his breath shaking the world, blurring at the edges from the light and the tears. He looked down at Bran, whose head rested once more on his thigh. The dog's eyes were closed, now his breathing calm, and even his body still shivering from exhaustion. Malcolm placed a hand on his chest, feeling the heartbeat beneath. "You did it, partner," he whispered. "You saved them." The golden light filtered fully through the canopy, now painting the wet leaves with fire and warmth. The jungle that had howled with fury just hours ago now rested in perfect calm, its every creature aware that something sacred had occurred within that clearing. Malcolm Pierce sat beside Bran, one hand still on the dog's neck, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his companion's heart as it beat against his palm. The gorilla family had drawn together under the returning sun, the mother humming softly as she cradled her revived child. The father stood just behind them, silent, powerful, still breathing hard, but no longer with anger. The baby's soft breaths filled the air, blending with the hum of insects and the distant call of birds. It was life reclaiming the world. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full. Full of things that had no names, understanding, sorrow, forgiveness, and something close to love. Malcolm felt that weight pressing gently against his chest, a warmth that replaced the years of hollow guilt he had carried. He exhaled slowly, realizing his body was trembling not from cold, but from the enormity of what had happened. Bran stirred at his side, raising his head, eyes tired but alert. The dog's fur had begun to dry, and the mud on his muzzle cracked as he yawned softly. Malcolm smiled weakly, scratching behind his ear. "You did good, partner," he whispered. "You did better than anyone could have asked." Bran leaned into the touch, his tail brushing once against the ground. The sound of movement drew Malcolm's gaze upward. The gorilla mother rose first, holding her baby close, her face calm, now eyes reflecting the morning light. She glanced toward him once, just once, and the look was enough. There was no fear left, only quiet gratitude. She turned toward the forest, taking a step into the tall grass. The father followed her with heavy steps, his size casting long shadows that rippled over the mud. Malcolm watched them, unsure whether to move or speak. The world felt balanced again, as if anything louder than a whisper might break the spell. The mother paused at the edge of the clearing, looking back. Her gaze lingered on Malcolm and Bran. She gave a soft sound, a low melodic hum that rose and fell in a tone both mournful and gentle. It was a goodbye, though neither man nor dog needed translation. The father stopped beside her, his massive frame catching the sun. For a moment he stood still, as though weighing a decision that reached beyond instinct. Then, to Malcolm's astonishment, he turned back. Bran tensed his ears, rising a quiet growl forming deep in his throat, but Malcolm touched his back gently. "Easy," he murmured. The father gorilla walked slowly toward them, his heavy feet sinking into the mud. His eyes were fixed on Malcolm, his posture not aggressive but deliberate, every movement measured. The sound of his breathing filled the clearing like the rhythm of distant thunder. He stopped a few feet away and lowered his gaze. In his right hand, gripped delicately between thick fingers, was Bran's ranger medallion. The same one the dog had pushed toward the baby earlier, a symbol of service and compassion, now gleaming faintly with sunlight and mud. The father crouched, his great arm extending forward. Malcolm's heart pounded. The massive hand lowered, placing the medallion gently on the ground between them. The gorilla's fingers lingered for a second before withdrawing. The meaning was clear. It wasn't just a return, it was acknowledgement. A gesture that transcended the boundaries of language and reason, the ultimate act of respect from one protector to another. Malcolm's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, blinking away fresh tears. "Thank you," he whispered, though he knew the words were unnecessary. The father tilted his head slightly, eyes locking on Bran. The dog rose slowly, cautious but unafraid. He took one hesitant step forward, then another, stopping at the edge of the silver token. For a few seconds, they simply looked at each other. Two guardians from different worlds, bound by the same code. The father's massive head lowered further, inch by inch, until his forehead brushed Bran's. The contact was brief, but powerful, a connection beyond sound or understanding. Bran stood motionless, then exhaled softly, tail swaying once before he stepped back. The gorilla rose again, his immense form towering against the sun. The gesture had said everything. Malcolm knelt and picked up the medallion, turning it over in his muddy fingers. The scratches glimmered like scars, each one earned, each one meaningful. "Guess it's yours again," he murmured to Bran, his voice catching. The dog barked, once the sound low but proud. The father turned and joined his mate at the forest's edge. The mother's eyes met Malcolm's one final time before she disappeared into the foliage, the sunlight reflecting on her wet fur. The father paused halfway into the shadows, glancing back just once. He lifted his chin slightly, an echo of the human gesture Malcolm had shown hours before, palms open, peaceful. Malcolm raised his hand, instinctively, fingers spread, mirroring the sign. Two fathers, once divided by instinct, now stood united by understanding. Then the giant was gone, his dark form swallowed by the green. The forest closed behind them, branches swaying gently as if sealing the moment away. The sound of the baby's faint cries faded into the distance until only the whisper of the wind remained. Malcolm stayed kneeling for a long time, staring at the place where they had vanished. Bran pressed against his side, warm and steady, anchoring him to the world that remained. "They're safe now," Malcolm said quietly, though his voice trembled. Bran looked up, eyes calm, his chest rising with deep, slow breaths. The jungle began to breathe again, two leaves rustling softly, the trickle of water returning to its course. The forest had quieted into that rare stillness that follows revelation. The morning sun climbed higher, pouring long golden beams across the clearing where the earth still glistened with rain and tears. Malcolm Pierce stood slowly, knees aching from hours in the mud, his heart still heavy, but alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Bran remained by his side, head tilted toward the edge of the trees where the gorilla family had disappeared, his posture calm, his tail motionless, his breathing steady. The sound of the river behind them was softer now, a whisper instead of a roar, as if even the water had learned gentleness after all it had destroyed. The air smelled of moss and wet leaves, of endings and beginnings. Malcolm bent down and rubbed Bran's neck fingers, tracing the medallion that gleamed faintly against the dog's chest. "Come on, partner," he said softly. "Let's head home." The word felt strange on his tongue, home, but for the first time in years, it meant something again. They began walking through the wet grass, their boots and paws leaving deep prints that the next rain would wash away. Behind them, the clearing already looked different, lighter, somehow touched by peace. Halfway to the ridge, Malcolm stopped. A low rumble rolled through the distance, faint but distinct, rising and falling through the canopy. He froze, breath-catching. It wasn't thunder. It was a roar, a long, resonant call that came from somewhere deep in the jungle. It carried no anger, no grief, only acknowledgement. A farewell. Bran's ears perked, and he looked back toward the sound, letting out a soft bark that echoed once before fading. Malcolm closed his eyes and whispered, "Goodbye, old friend." Then he turned towards the trail again, his pace slower, thoughtful. The jungle no longer felt hostile. It felt alive, full of unseen eyes and unseen forgiveness. Every branch that brushed his arm felt like a benediction. Every gust of wind like a thank you whispered by the trees. The deeper he walked, the clearer his mind became. He thought about the broken barrier upstream, the negligence, the guilt that had haunted him since the night his daughter's life slipped away because he had taken one call too late. For years he had tried to bury that guilt under work, under routine, under storms and solitude. But here in the heart of the wild, forgiveness had taken form not in words, but in the breath of a creature that should have died and didn't. Bran nudged his leg, breaking the trance, and Malcolm smiled faintly. "I know," he said. "We're not done yet." They reached the overlook above the gorge, where the river bent through the valley. The storm had stripped the land bare, in places leaving patches of raw earth between the trees. The sun hit the water, turning it to molten silver. He knelt and placed a hand on the ground, feeling the damp soil pulse faintly beneath his palm. "We'll rebuild it," he murmured. "The right way this time." Bran barked, once quiet and certain, then sat beside him, tail brushing the dirt. The wind rose briefly, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers blooming where floodwater had receded. The world, it seemed, never stopped healing. It just needed time. When they finally reached the ranger station at the edge of the forest, the place looked smaller than Malcolm remembered. The walls were still scarred by the last storm, and the roof sagged where the weight of the rain had settled. But to him, it looked like sanctuary. He stepped inside Bran, following close, their wet footprints marking the wooden floor. The air inside smelled of smoke paper and the faint sweetness of coffee gone cold. On the far wall hung a photograph, a young girl with bright eyes and an easy smile, holding Bran as a puppy. Malcolm stopped in front of it, his breath catching. The picture had faded around the edges, but her face still shone like the memory of sunlight. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his ranger's badge, the metal dull and scratched. For a long moment, he turned it in his hand, the same hand that had pressed life back into a small creature hours earlier. He thought of the gorilla mother's eyes, the father's bowed head, the baby's tiny breath, and the roar that followed them all. Then he pinned the badge beside the photo. The two pieces of his life, duty and loss, finally hung together where they belonged. "I did what I could, kiddo," he whispered, "and I finally made it right." Bran walked to his side, sitting close enough that Malcolm could feel his warmth. The dog looked up at the photo, then back at him, as if understanding more than any human ever could. Malcolm knelt, pressing his forehead gently against Bran's. "You brought me back," he said. "You never gave up, even when I did." Bran's tail brushed the floor once, twice. Outside, the sunlight deepened, and the sound of the jungle flowed back into the world, birds calling branches, creaking water running free again. Malcolm stood and stepped onto the porch. The air was different now, cleaner, lighter, full of promise. He looked back toward the forest, its green depths alive with mystery. Somewhere out there, a family of gorillas was moving through the mist, the baby clinging tightly to its mother's back, the father keeping watch. The image filled his mind with peace instead of sorrow. Bran stood beside him, ears flicking towards the wind. "They're safe," Malcolm said. "That's all that matters." Bran gave a quiet bark, low and final. The ranger smiled, watching the horizon. "Maybe that's what it means to serve," he said softly. "Not control, not command, just protect. Just care." The breeze shifted, carrying the faintest echo of that same roar from before, distant but unmistakable. Malcolm closed his eyes and let it wash over him. The sound was no longer foreign. It was kinship. It was the voice of everything alive, calling to everything that still dared to love despite the scars. He rested a hand on Bran's back, feeling the rise and fall of his chest, the steady rhythm of a heart that had carried him through storms and silence. "Let's take a walk," he said, stepping down from the porch. Together they moved into the sunlight, the mud drying beneath their feet, the forest ahead glowing with gold. The world was scarred, imperfect, and yet somehow still worth saving. And as they disappeared down the trail, the last echo of the father's roar faded into birdsong, the two sounds blending into one, a single note that carried the weight of everything that mattered: compassion, forgiveness, and the unspoken truth that every creature, no matter how broken, is capable of beginning again. The end. If this story touched you, give it a like and hit subscribe so we can share more true stories of compassion and courage. Tell me what part of Malcolm and Bran's journey moved you most, and where you're watching from down in the comments. Your thoughts keep these stories alive.